Hey, good morning, guys. Welcome to another day. It's going to be a little different today. You know what? I'm going to take off my mask for now. All right, so here we go with another week. This weekend, I hope you guys had a good Memorial Day weekend. I spent it pretty much sitting around the house for the most part, a little bit of swimming, a walk around the neighborhood. But I know a lot of people went out to the lake or to the river, or like you were out on vacation. It's like the pandemic is over, but it's not. And that's one of those concerning things is if you guys are not social distancing, we may see a second wave of this pandemic with more people getting infected. But one thing I want to talk about is the restaurants. Restaurants are starting to open again, trying to practice social distancing, and some of them are making people wear masks. Employees, obviously you can't eat with a mask on. Employees wearing masks, and some are not. That brings into question employee rights, right? So let's say you're working for a company and you're serving tables at a restaurant, and your employer says, you know what, I don't want you to wear a mask. It's just bad for business. They can't see your smile. We want to make sure that you have a good presentation to the customers. So even though the whole rules say you should wear a mask when you talk to customers, don't wear a mask. I don't want you to do that. What rights do you have? Do you have the right to say, well, I think I need to protect myself, I'm going to wear a mask? This is one of those things that we have to think about. There's a fine line between entitlement and advocacy. Entitlement is where you think, I deserve this stuff, this belongs to me, and nobody can take it away from me. And then there's advocacy saying, no, actually, this is something I need to have, and I need to speak up for myself to make sure I get it. Some employees may want to demand only certain hours or privileges, but most of the power still lies with the employer. You can't walk into a Panera asking to be paid $20 an hour and only work Friday afternoons. They may have something to say about what their needs are and what they're able to pay you. Right? History has shown us that there needs to be a balance between those two things. So today's lesson is the Homestead Strike. Homestead Strike and the Homestead Act. I want to mention both of those in the same breath because those are two things that you learn in U.S. history this year, and you'll learn them again in high school. But the Homestead Act was in 1862, and that was basically the act that says, hey, we're going to give away cheap land to people as long as they go out and they settle the West. Go out, establish a home on a land, improve it a little bit, stay there 5 years, and then you get to have it at a really low price. Great deal. I predict that we're going to do something similar when it comes to populating the asteroid belt. Asteroid mining, I think they're going to offer some incentives to get people to get out there and start mining asteroids. Wait, we'll find out. We'll find out in a few years. But here we come to the topic of the day, which is the Homestead Strike of 1892. So in 1883, we talked about Andrew Carnegie, right? He was the steel king, right? The king of steel. He was developing the steel industry, and he basically developed a monopoly with vertical integration. He owned everything from the coal fields all the way through the steel production plant and all the distribution. He was really rocking it. He made a lot of money, and by the time it was 1892, he was making $25 million a year. Now, I haven't made $1 million yet. I don't know about you, but $1 million is a lot of money. In 1892, it was a lot of money, and for $25 million, he was making a lot of money. So he bought this steel mill called the Homestead Mill, and he bought that in 1883. 1886, we'll skip that part. So anyway, so the Homestead Mill in Homestead, Pennsylvania, this steel mill was having some trouble in 1892. What happened was the steel mill workers were working on this contract with what they call a sliding scales, meaning that they were paid a certain amount per ton of steel that they produced. And if the price in the market for steel went up, then actually their pay went up a little bit. And if the price of steel went down, then their pay went down. So, if the market was good for steel and steel was doing good on, selling overseas and things like that, then they would get paid more money, even if they weren't making any more steel than they normally did. If they made a greater quantity of steel, then they'd make even more. So we weren't based pay on hours that they worked, they were based pay on how much they were actually producing and what the value of that was on the market. Seems kind of reasonable. The upper limit, there was no upper limit. The more value that steel made, the more that they would pay you. But on the lower end, they said that we're gonna put a minimum. We're gonna say that we won't work for less than this certain amount. And they had agreed on $25 per ton of steel was the minimum that they would pay for, or that they would work for. And the plant had agreed to that. This is where we ran into the problem, because the steel plant said that we don't really want to have a union here anymore, because they keep negotiating their wages and they keep saying that we want to have more money and we want to say a little bit more about how things go around here. And so the steel plant said, no, we're actually going to cancel that contract that we had with you. And they renewed that contract once a year anyway, so that wasn't a big deal. But it was that, okay, for this next contract, we're going to drop the pay for ton of steel. The minimum is going to go down to like $23 a ton. And the steel workers said, no, we don't want that. We have to have our minimum. Don't drop it or we will go on strike. The union was a collection of workers. The concept of a union is meaning that if an employer hires you, they're hiring you as an individual. But if there are a bunch of individuals that do a common task, or like they're all involved in the same industry, then they would work to collectively bargain, to talk to that employer to say, you know what, what's in the interest of one of us is really in the interest of all of us. So we're going to speak as a group, and you can talk to all of us about the pay or the conditions instead of just bargaining with one to one to one to one. It should be more efficient. It has definitely more power than an individual bargaining for themselves. And it's something that we still have unions today. There's a lot of union history that I could go into that I won't for this lesson because there's a lot, but a lot of protections, a lot of limitations we have to the workplace that we have now, we owe to the fights of the unions. So in this case, they're fighting for not getting a $25 down to $23 per ton minimum on their steel production. They want to make sure that it still stays kind of high. So the pay goes down, and Frick is the manager of the plant. Henry Frick, he cut the minimum pay to workers. He argued that he invested more money in better machinery. So actually with this better machinery, you should be able to make more tons of steel. So in the end, you'll make more money anyway. And the workers said, no, it doesn't matter if we were going to make more money with your new equipment. We're not going to take a lower pay. The workers refused. They planned to strike. Page 2. Carnegie told Frick to handle the situation. So it was Carnegie's mill, but Carnegie was actually on vacation in Scotland, and he didn't come back for this whole problem. He said, Frick, you handle it. Frick has a history of not liking unions. He had broken up union strikes before. He would rather not even deal with the union. So he wasn't really in the mood to have a conversation with them about, well, let's talk something out, what works for both of us. He was just going to say, this is the offer, that's all I'm going to do, take it or leave it. They say, well, we're probably going to plan a strike, and he says, fine. And so he starts building a fence around the factory. He had like a 12-foot high fence with holes through it so you can put guns through it if you need to. He locks the doors, and so basically it's a shutout, a lockout, meaning that he's not going to let any workers in. You're not fired, but you can't work until you agree to these terms. And so the workers say, okay, well, we're going to do a strike. So they do a strike, and he's doing a lockout, and they're at odds, right? So nobody's getting any work done, nobody's getting any pay, and everything has come to a standstill. So Frick asked the local sheriff for help. Local sheriff comes in and says, all right, guys, what's the problem here? I'd like to help. And the workers are not going to have it. They say, nope, this doesn't concern you, sheriff, go back home. We're not going to let you even enter the town. And so the sheriff goes back home. What's he going to do? So Frick hires the Pinkerton detective company to come enforce this. And let's step back for a moment and talk about who Pinkerton is, because it's an important name in U.S. history. Pinkerton goes back to the 1840s, 1850s. They were the Pinkerton Detective Agency. They did like solving crimes, a lot of work for the railroads, but then they started branching out and doing work for local law enforcement agencies. Oh, you've got a criminal on the loose, give us the clues and we'll hunt him down, we'll figure out who he is. They did some intelligence work for the Union Army during the Civil War. They figured out a plot to assassinate President Lincoln, and they were able to hustle him around so that he was not assassinated. They have a long history, and they're actually still around. Actually, if you're interested, the Pinkerton Agency is hiring a security agent for a job in Folsom right now, so maybe you want to think about that. They are a pseudo-government agency. They work with government agencies, but they are not the government. In this case, they were hired by Frick as an outside agency to come in and, number one, guard the factory, make sure that the workers that were on strike did not come in, and number two, to make sure that the other workers, the non-union workers that Frick was hiring, were able to come in and start working to bring the factory back up to working conditions without having to deal with that union. Now, this is called a scab, when you have somebody who is trying to work while there is a strike going on. And scabs are generally not looked upon very favorably by the people that are on strike. And indeed, in this situation, they had trouble finding people that were willing to be scabs and work in the factory during this time period. But sometimes people are really desperate for money and they really want a job. And if there's a job opening up, they'll take the job even though there is a strike going on. So there were about 3,000 workers that were on strike, and Frick hired non-union workers to replace them, and then 300 armed guards from the Pinkerton Agency. It didn't go well. Someone started shooting. As soon as the Pinkerton guards were arriving in a boat, somebody started shooting on the boat, somebody started shooting on the shore, and at the end of it all, you had at least 10 people dead. You had the Pinkerton agents, once they surrendered, they were walking through town and they were beaten up as they went, and so more of them died. Every single one of them was absolutely brutalized just for being there. There were riots, and the strike lasted for several months. They say about 4 months long. The governor of Pennsylvania responded to Frick's call and said, hey, you know what? I brought in the sheriff, that didn't work. I brought in Pinkerton, that didn't work. Help me out here. So the governor of Pennsylvania sent in the state militia, which nowadays that would be the National Guard. Basically, he said, look, I'm going to send in these troops. So he sent in 8,000 troops to handle the situation. And the militia went in and they basically guarded it so that the scabs could work in the factory, and the factory was up and running, and the strike was still going on. All the union workers were still in the town trying to negotiate to come back to work. And eventually the union gave up. The labor union gave up. They lost the battle. They had to, some of them never got hired again. Some of them had to go back to the factory and get hired as an individual without any union negotiating, and they were hired for much less than their normal wages. And you have to ask, was this a worthy battle? Did they really need a specific minimum pay? Was it a difference between $23 and $25? Was this worth these lives? Was it worth this disruption? Was this worth this factory shutdown? But you want to keep in mind, it wasn't about a specific pay. It was about control. And not a selfish control either. It's a control. The company wants to control their assets, their resources, and what they are able to do to make money. And the employees want to control the safety of their workplace and the integrity of their job, the security of their job, knowing if they're going to have a job and knowing if they're going to be paid enough to handle their day-to-day life. You want to keep in mind, this was the age of company towns, and there are a number of other situations that we could go into with Pullman, with Hershey, with other companies that had effectively their own towns. Anytime there was a town popping up that had an industry that it surrounded, that company not only owned the factory and the machinery and the working conditions, which you would expect, but also they owned the homes that the workers were living in. They would own the stores in town. If you were going to buy something, you were effectively buying it from your employer. They would own all of the street repairs. If you were going to have repairs on your street, well, that was up to the company. All of these things were under the control of the company. So there was no escape from control of the company in your life. And as we look at abolition and the end of slavery, and we look at the rise of industrialism at the same time, there's a different form of servitude where the employees have less and less control over their own lives. These struggles continue as we try to balance the needs of business with the security and integrity of the employee. The company can't operate without the employee working, but the employee doesn't have a job unless the company is able to succeed. It's this constant struggle. I'm going to leave you with a question on that. As you log into Schoology for attendance today, then in Google Classroom, your question of the day: what are your priorities for working conditions? So when you get a job, what are your top 3 priorities? What do you want in that workplace? And you could talk about how much it pays, you could talk about safety, you could talk about benefits, but try not to be greedy. Try not to think, well, I want them to serve me apple pie on my lunch break because I like apple pie. Okay, that would be nice, but maybe think about if you have to choose between apple pie on your lunch break and having to work 16-hour shifts, which one is more important to you? So think about those things. Today is the last day to possibly turn in any late assignments for this year, or really this trimester, but turn them in as you can. I know a lot of you guys have been scrambling over the weekend for that. Appreciate it. And I'll talk to you tomorrow. Have a great day. Oh, and we're going to have a Zoom later today. So I'll post the details for that, and it'll be our last Zoom of the school year. Have a great day, guys. Bye-bye.